$500,000. That is what Matt Roloff thought Amy's share of a multi-million-dollar television and agricultural empire was worth. Not as an opening offer in a negotiation, as a final number, presented with the apparent confidence of someone who believed it would stick. It didn't stick. And the reason it didn't stick is sitting in a stack of documents that Caryn Chandler, the woman who replaced Amy in that farmhouse, had been holding on to for years without ever mentioning them. This is the story of how a bank financing application became the most important piece of evidence in Amy Roloff's divorce settlement, and how the whole scheme unraveled on a witness stand in an Oregon courtroom. To understand what happened, you have to go back to the point when Matt decided he wanted full control of Roloff Farms. For most of the years the show was on the air, the farm was a shared marital asset. Matt and Amy ran it together in whatever complicated, dysfunctional way they ran everything together. When the divorce was finalized in 2016, the question of what to actually do with the farm was left unresolved for years. Amy still had an ownership stake. Matt was running operations, and the value of the property and the business attached to it was, to put it politely, a matter of significant disagreement. Matt's position was that the farm wasn't worth that much. This is the argument you make when you want to buy someone out cheap. The farm is aging, the pumpkin patch revenue fluctuates, the buildings need work, the land value is complicated by its agricultural designation. Under that framework, he came to Amy with an offer in the range of $500,000 and seemed to expect that she would take it. Amy did not take it. What Amy's legal team eventually discovered was that while Matt was presenting the farm to her as a modest agricultural property of limited value, he and Caryn were simultaneously presenting it to a bank as something considerably more valuable. They needed financing. They had formed a new corporate entity, Roloff Holdings, Inc., and to secure the loans they were applying for, the bank required independent appraisals of the business. This is standard practice in commercial lending. Banks don't take your word for what your business is worth. They hire professionals. In this case, according to what came out in the litigation, the appraisals came back with valuations between $10 and $12 million. Firms with serious reputations, the kind of firms a bank actually trusts, looked at the Roloff operation and concluded it was a significant going concern. Caryn Chandler was the farm manager. That was her official role. She was involved in the day-to-day operations, the business filings, the administrative side of things, which means she was in the chain of communication for these appraisals. She had access to them. She knew what they said. Amy did not know what they said. Amy was being offered $500,000. I want to sit with that sequence for a second because it matters. The same business that was being valued at $10 to $12 million for the purpose of obtaining bank financing was simultaneously being described to Amy, a co-owner, as worth a fraction of that. The appraisals were not disclosed to her during the buyout negotiations. They were in Caryn's possession, and they stayed there. When Amy's attorney, Miss Albright, got Caryn on the witness stand, the confrontation was not subtle. She placed the appraisal documents on the table in front of Caryn, 3 of them, substantial documents from credible firms, and then she started asking questions about them. Caryn's position throughout the litigation had been built around a different appraisal entirely, an appraisal from David Peters, who is her brother-in-law. That document valued the farm at just over $1 million. That is the number Matt's side was working from. That is the basis on which Amy was being told her share was worth $500,000. So in the courtroom, you have, on one side, appraisals from institutions with no relationship to either party, produced for the purpose of a bank transaction in which accuracy was financially necessary, valuing the business at $10 to $12 million. And on the other side, an appraisal from Caryn's brother-in-law, produced in the context of a divorce dispute, valuing it at $1 million. Miss Albright's job was not complicated at that point. She just had to ask Caryn to explain it. The explanation did not hold up well. There is a version of events where you could argue that the bank appraisals and the buyout appraisal were measuring different things, or using different methodologies, or capturing the business at different moments in time. My read is that those arguments were available to Caryn's team, and they tried to use them. But the gap is so large and the financial interest so obvious that it's genuinely hard to construct a good faith explanation for why a farm worth $12 million for borrowing purposes was worth $1 million for settlement purposes. The brother-in-law appraisal was the central issue. Courts care a lot about conflicts of interest in expert testimony and appraisals. When the person producing the valuation that benefits you happens to be married to your relative, that is exactly the kind of conflict a court is going to scrutinize. And when that appraisal is being compared to multiple independent appraisals commissioned by an institution with actual financial skin in the game, the brother-in-law document doesn't survive the comparison. What I think happened, and I want to be clear, this is my interpretation rather than a finding I can cite directly, is that Matt and Caryn genuinely believed Amy would settle before any of this came to light. The $500,000 offer wasn't an opening bid in a fair negotiation. It was a number designed to close the deal before discovery got complicated. If Amy had taken the money and walked away, the bank appraisals would have stayed buried. She didn't walk away, and her legal team was good enough to pull on the right threads. The financing application was the thread that mattered. When you apply for a commercial loan, you file documents. Those documents don't disappear. They exist in bank records, in the files of the appraisal firms, in the corporate records of Roloff Holdings, Inc. A competent attorney doing discovery in a divorce case involving a business knows to look for loan applications, because that's where people tell the truth about what their business is worth, because they're trying to borrow money, and lying on a loan application is a federal crime. Matt and Caryn were in the position of having told a bank the farm was worth $12 million and simultaneously telling Amy it was worth $1 million. Those two statements cannot both be true. And once both statements are in front of a judge, someone has to explain the contradiction. Caryn was the one on the stand trying to explain it. I don't have a transcript of that testimony, and I'm not going to pretend I know exactly what she said word for word. What has been reported about the proceedings suggests her testimony was significantly damaged by the introduction of those documents. When your key witness has to explain why she had access to documents that contradicted her side's valuation and never mentioned them, the testimony tends to go badly. The role she played in this matters beyond just the courtroom moment. Caryn wasn't a passive bystander in the farm operations. She was embedded in the business. She was in the administrative and managerial structures that produced and handled these documents. The suggestion that she simply didn't realize the bank appraisals were relevant or that she didn't understand what they contained is hard to take seriously given her position. This is also the part of the story where the timeline of her relationship with Matt becomes relevant. Caryn and Matt were involved before the divorce was final, and she moved into the farmhouse, the same house Amy had lived in for years, during the period when the settlement negotiations were ongoing. She was simultaneously a romantic partner, a farm manager, and a participant in the business structure that was producing documents relevant to Amy's settlement. That's not a neutral position. Amy has been publicly gracious about a lot of this, at least in the sense that she moved on, bought her own place, remarried, and by most public indications is living a life she's happy with. But the legal record of what she was being offered and what was being withheld from her during that period is not gracious. It's a specific documented pattern of conduct, and the courtroom collapse of Caryn's testimony was the moment when the full shape of it became visible. The final settlement terms haven't been fully reported in a way I can cite specifically, but it's publicly known that Amy received substantially more than the original $500,000 offer. The farm sold for a price significantly above what Matt had been claiming it was worth, which by itself tells you something about how the valuation dispute ended up resolving. There is also the question of what this does to the public presentation of Caryn and Matt more broadly. They have been building a brand since the show shifted in their direction. The pumpkin season content, the farm expansion, the social media presence. Part of that brand is the implicit narrative that Caryn has been a good faith partner in the farm's success, and that the post-divorce arrangement was fair to everyone. The bank appraisals complicate that narrative considerably. When you've been on television for years as part of a story about family and authenticity, and then court documents surface suggesting that the person who had access to $12 million valuations was simultaneously allowing a $1 million figure to be used against her predecessor, the gap between the on-screen persona and the documented behavior is significant. I'm not going to claim I know what Caryn was thinking. I don't. Maybe she convinced herself the methodologies were different enough to be defensible. Maybe she believed Matt's framing of the situation completely. Maybe she understood exactly what was happening and made a choice. I genuinely don't know, and I'd rather admit that than build a confident psychological portrait I can't actually support. What I can say is that the documents are what they are. The bank was told one number. Amy was told another. Caryn had the bank documents, and when a lawyer put them on a table in front of her in a courtroom, the explanation wasn't convincing enough to hold the case together. There's something worth noting about how this kind of financial maneuvering tends to work in divorce cases involving businesses. This is not unique to the roll-offs. The pattern of one party controlling the financial records of a shared business and using that information asymmetry to lowball a settlement offer is common enough that family law attorneys have standard playbooks for dealing with it. The move that Matt's team made, using a favorable appraisal from a connected source while the more credible bank documents sat unmentioned, is a recognizable strategy. It sometimes works. It works when the other party is under financial pressure to settle quickly, or when their legal representation isn't thorough enough to find the financing records. Amy's situation didn't work out that way. She had good enough representation, she didn't collapse under the pressure of the initial offer, and the discovery process did its job. The pumpkin season footage, the heartwarming farm content, the scenes of Caryn and Matt building their life together at Roll-Off Farms. All of that continued to air and stream while this litigation was happening behind the scenes. There's a version of this story that is legitimately surreal. You could be watching an episode of Little People, Big World, seeing the farm presented as a thriving legacy business, while simultaneously the people running that farm were in a courtroom arguing it was only worth $1 million. Television production and legal proceedings operate on different timelines and with different incentives, and TLC was not in the business of airing footage that complicated their talent's legal positions. So the audience watching the show didn't see this. Most of the audience still doesn't know this happened in any detail. That's the gap this kind of coverage is trying to fill. The show has a particular narrative. The legal record has a different one. Both exist, and people who care about what actually happened deserve to know both. For Amy, the outcome represents something. She was presented with a number designed to make her go away quietly, and she didn't. The legal process eventually forced the production of documents that the other side had not volunteered. Those documents told a more honest story about what the farm was worth. And the person who had those documents and didn't mention them had to answer for that in public, in a courtroom, on the record. Whether that feels like justice is probably going to depend on how you were following this situation and how much you believed in the version of events Matt's team was presenting. If you took the narrative at face value, the appraisal reveal is genuinely shocking. If you were already skeptical of the $500,000 number from the beginning, it's more like confirmation of something that already felt off. My honest read is that the original offer was never made in good faith. That's not a generous interpretation of Matt's motives, and I recognize that, but the math doesn't work any other way. You don't offer $500,000 for a $10 to $12 million business because you made an innocent calculation error. You do it because you think the other person doesn't know what the business is actually worth, and you're betting they won't find out. The bet was wrong. Caryn's position in all of this is more complicated to assess. She was not the one making the buyout offer. She was the farm manager, the romantic partner, and the person who had access to the appraisals. Whether she actively participated in a strategy to withhold them, or whether she was following Matt's lead without fully thinking through what she was doing, I can't say with certainty. The courtroom outcome suggests the judge found her testimony unpersuasive. That's the documented part. The rest is inference. What I find genuinely interesting about this case from a structural standpoint is how often the banking relationship ended up being the undoing of the scheme. This is worth noting for anyone who's in a situation where one party controls the financial records of a shared business. Banks require honest valuations because loans have to be paid back, and because lying to get a loan is a serious crime. That creates a paper trail that is very hard to make disappear because it's sitting in the files of an institution that has no interest in helping you maintain a fiction. When you need that financing, you have to tell the truth to the bank. And when you're also trying to lowball a settlement with a co-owner, those two truths are going to collide eventually. In this case, they collided in a courtroom, in front of a lawyer who had done her homework, in front of a judge who understood what the documents meant. Amy Roloff has not, as far as I know, made extensive public statements about the specifics of the financial litigation. That restraint is probably partly legal and partly personal. But the fact that she bought her own property, built her own life, and appears genuinely settled while Matt and Caryn are still running pumpkin seasons and posting content to maintain their audience is its own kind of statement. She walked away with what the farm was actually worth, not what she was told it was worth. That's the bottom line. Did Caryn understand the full implications of what she was participating in? Or did she walk into that courtroom thinking she could hold the story together? That's the question I genuinely don't know the answer to. And honestly, I think it's the most interesting question in this whole situation, because the answer tells you a lot about how this relationship between Matt and Caryn actually functions, about who's driving decisions and who's following along. What do you think happened? Did Caryn go into that courtroom knowing her testimony was going to fall apart? Or did she actually believe the brother-in-law appraisal was defensible? I'm curious whether people who've been following this story closely have watching it, because I've gone back and forth on it myself.